Hello, pastors, church leaders of Greater Austin. Stephen Brewer here with Austin Disaster Relief Network. And we just wanted to give you an overview if you weren't able to be a part of one of the recent pastors' briefings that we've held recently in response to the winter storm. And really the objective of these gatherings, and even this short recording here for you, is to cover at a high level just an overview of all that's taken place up to this point in the response effort, as well as share where we are in that timeline and the transition in the days ahead into the recovery process, what we call shepherding families, explaining what that is and refreshing some of you who have had experience, but maybe even informing some of you for the first time. And the unique opportunity that we as the church have to come alongside of these families in a long-term capacity. And then the how we do that, the what, why, and the how that actually works. We'll talk about details of that process and explain next steps for you to engage those within your congregation. Give them the opportunity to come alongside of these families in a life-impacting and transforming way. So as we begin, I just want to acknowledge some of this timeline that we have found ourselves in. In that first week of response, it was nothing like any of us had seen or experienced before in Greater Austin. From an ADRN disaster deployment response, our first focus, we had leadership in the Emergency Operations Center alongside of leadership all throughout the city, the chiefs of police, chiefs of fires, they gather into that one room to make decisions at the highest level. ADRN had leadership representing the local church from that room. And the first needs were those of sheltering, and so we were mobilizing volunteers to help with sheltering and support, even helping lead a couple of the AISD shelters, churches. Several churches opened up as warming shelters across the city to be a warm place for people to get to. Also, during that first period of time, we were asked to actually help lead out a 4x4 driver initiative. That turned into a remarkable operation, receiving several hundred requests over the course of those first couple of weeks, which went from moving key personnel and resources to ultimately getting water now to survivors that were back in their homes after the shelter shut down. But after about that first week of time of intensity, like many of us had not seen, no power, no water even for a period of time, pipes bursting all over the city, there was a transition point to that next phase. That next phase was crisis cleanup. We began initially identifying that there would be hundreds of homes across the city that would need help with cleanup, whether it be tree debris or in their home with water damage. And so we began to organize this collaborative effort where dozens of churches across the city have actually engaged in this process, taken on homes and began to help them clean up and restore those homes. Volunteer plumbers were coming from outside of the city to help clean up those pipes and restore those homes that were needed. And we were helping organize and support them, connecting them to the needs. Intake centers was another thing that we were doing here for those first few weeks. And over the past about 3 weekends, we have done an intake center over each one of those weekends. That is for us one of these key ways that we engage survivors in a response. And so what it looks like is ADRN trained volunteers and the emotional care training that we have. It's internationally recognized. We call it critical incident stress management. They are trained, they're prepared in these intake centers. We'll schedule intakes for these survivors that have need, impacted by the winter storm, and one by one, or families that will come in, and they'll be able to hear their story, hear the impact that this family has gone through, help them navigate through whatever amount of trauma that they might have experienced through that, offer them some immediate financial support through the form of gift cards. And then they ask them this powerful question is, would you like to be connected to a local church? And many of them, as you can imagine, would say yes. And many of them have and are going to need the help of someone in the community, like the local church, to come alongside of them over these next several weeks, if not months. And that's what we'll talk about again for the majority of our time here. But before we do that, I just want to give God praise and glory and honor for all that He's done. I mean, there were shower operations that were happening at churches throughout the city. And there's a document that we'll include as well, just giving some of these details of really only what God could get credit for, but how He used His church in such a strategic way. And we know that many stories go untold, even through this report, for you who were leading in your own communities with your own people. And so we celebrate getting to be at the table with you, to be God's church, His chosen vessel to reveal His light and His love in times of crisis. Just a couple of quick testimonies. We had one of the leaders of Capital Metro was in that EOC operation with us, and he said, "You guys picked up my mom he said, I'm so grateful to get to meet you. I was up here working. My mom was stuck in a home without power, I believe, possibly for days. He had no ability to help his own mother. And then he's like, Mom, how'd you get to Round Rock? And his mom shares with him, it was these guys from ADRN came by with a truck or a 4x4 vehicle and helped me get there. We heard other stories. A key leader in the city said, hey, crisis cleanup works. Here I am doing kind of the operational, the organization stuff that I do. My own home needed help. And he had these trees down in my front yard, and she asked for help. She put her name and number in the crisis cleanup, and she said some Lutheran church showed up and helped me clean my home, my yard, and even a story. There's just too many stories to share with you, but even opportunities to pray with people, leaders in the city. And even one example is the mayor was in the Palmer Event Center, one of the first days it was open, where they had a key need for volunteers. And he said, where are these volunteers coming from? Because he knew the roads were icy and they were encouraging people not to be on them. And she said, well, they're coming here from ADRN, one of the leaders there. And he said, well, why? How do they know? Why are they here? And maybe other organizations are not. And she scrolled through a text that she got on her phone because they said there was a hot need for these shelter workers, and they showed up. And so, again, praise God, and we just give him glory for the work that he has done through his church, because these are people at your congregations all throughout this city that are responding to the need and to the call at this moment. I could go on and tell stories about impact or all the things that were done, but really this is what we identify as the response phase of recovery. So there's really three elements of recovery. Most of what we actually spend our energy, time, and effort on is the readiness phase. It's everything that we do to set in place before the disaster ever takes place. And then the response. It's usually about that first month of response. It's the intensity of responding to the call, getting water to places and those who have need of it, operating shelters, helping drive 4x4 drivers, or mucking out houses, you name it, right? But all that's really the response phase. But then we shift into what we call the recovery phase. It's really about that 1 month to 6 month window. And this is where the strategic opportunity that we have to come alongside of families can be so impactful and even life-changing. We're convinced, even from the beginning in the formation of this network, that this would be our number one goal, is to connect families to the local church, to walk with them, to help them back on their feet in practical ways, because this is where transformation happens in the lives of the people that we serve. And we see it over and over and over again. And we believe that the church is not only uniquely positioned to respond with a long-term capacity made up here from this local community, unlike the other organizations that might come in for a season, help, and then transition to another disaster. Not only we're uniquely positioned, but we feel that we're uniquely called by the Lord to respond like the Good Samaritan would, to get off our own donkey and put the one who's been left for half dead, so to speak, on that donkey and help meet those needs. And Jesus said this is what it means to love our neighbor. And we have an incredible opportunity to do it. Just to give you a couple of examples of how this has happened in past disasters. I remember being in the Memorial Weekend flood, and we were doing a training in one of these churches. One of the sound techs who was kind of helping set up for the training, she said, I just want you to know that we are helping and sponsoring a family. She said, we started working with this family. We found out that she was Buddhist, and she didn't know anything about Jesus. And so we started telling her all about Jesus. And she said, this woman has given her life to Christ, has been baptized, and now is on fire for the Lord. We've heard other stories. I think about the one in Highland Lake's flood in 2018. If you folks remember, it was over 2,000 homes affecting that Marble Falls, Kingsland, Granite Shoals, Highland Lakes area. There was a story of a man that was affected by the flood. I believe he contracted some kind of contamination from the water, was hospitalized the very next day, and never left that hospital. In fact, one of the people, part of the Shepherd team, had gone in to meet him at the hospital at some point as they were walking with this family, and just compelled to share the gospel with him. And the man received Christ, gave his life to Christ, and passed away the very next day. Wow. this one life was saved in that moment. Out of all the work that was done, all the homes that were cleaned up, we know from heaven's perspective and the way heaven rejoices over one turning to the Lord, it was all worth it, even if it was just for the one, right? And these are some incredible stories of God breaking into humble hearts with his redemptive power when you have the life-on-life exchange. Now, I'll tell you, not every story, ends in great glory, right? Sometimes there's challenging cases. We're working with a family, maybe they're not grateful, but we can never underestimate the power of that seed of his life and love that was shown and demonstrated. And I'll tell you, sometimes we even have the opportunity to help believers, right? Those who are of the faith, and we know that we're compelled by Scripture to do that as well. So here's what I want to do. I want to begin to kind of unpack some of the how of shepherding, what that looks like. On the highest level, it is walking with a family for maybe 1 to 2, 3, 4 months, maybe sometimes 6 months if it's a little bit of a longer case, to help them back on their feet in practical ways, helping address the emotional needs that they have, the spiritual needs that they have, and of course the physical needs that they have. And when we talk about doing it through the context of the local church, it's really small groups inside of churches that we see being one of these constructs that's so powerful to come alongside of a family. Many churches across this city already have that construct within their church, right? These groups of 4, 5, or 10 that are already meeting together, already have relationships. How powerful would it be if just one of those people went through a training, understood what it meant to come alongside a family, began connecting relationally with this family, identifying the needs, and then bringing them back to that small group and saying, hey, here's their situation. Let's brainstorm. Let's pray together how we might be able to meet some of these needs, even if we're not able to meet all of them. And we've seen God do it over and over again. Not only change the lives of those that they're walking with, but change the lives of those who are doing the work. The small groups themselves are growing in their love for Christ and seeing his hand at work when they're asking him for help, and he shows up and does it. It's powerful. And so one of the things that I want to point us to as a resource as we begin to kind of think through what this looks like is what we call a disaster relief model for an individual church. And this just gives the highest level structure from church leadership's engagement, support, ultimately involvement with the network, and says, hey, we're going to encourage our people to respond in this way. And then identifying a disaster relief coordinator within a church. This is someone who really is maybe more of could be a volunteer. It could be a staff person, but someone who could kind of help take ownership of the response for a local church that's not the lead pastor. One of the first things we encourage that individual to do is have a core team of people around them. And of course, that can take time, but things can be accelerated in a time of disaster response as well. One of the things I really want to highlight here as a part of that core team is what we would call a disaster relief shepherd lead. Now, this person may be somebody that's simply had the opportunity to shepherd before, or maybe they're the first one to do it in your church, and the second time they go through, now they have an opportunity to coach others and how they've done it. And so, for example, if you have a church with, say, 10 small groups, and man, every one of them is encouraged to respond, and maybe 5 of them raise their hand and say, we'll take a family. Now you've got 5 groups. This shepherd lead would be ultimately a support to them, almost like a shepherd of shepherds. And so our encouragement behind this is that you would have at least one source of an upline within your church for people just have questions as they're doing just life on life. As you know, that can be difficult, navigating through a recovery with somebody who's lost a number of things or maybe had some challenges prior to this disaster taking place. At no point are shepherds ever expected to show up and have all the answers or be the hero, but we're to point to the one who does have all the answers, who can meet all their needs, who is the hero, right, in their lives. And one other resource that I want to empower you with is this document, and this is something that we can make available to any individual. And so I'll use it to explain a little bit, but it's also just a great tool to just be able to hand people and say, hey, if you're interested in this, here's some more details about it, right? As you're encouraging people, potentially within your congregation, small group leaders, or small groups themselves. And so at the first section, it just kind of gives a high level of what shepherding is to those who have no grid for it. It's like, hey, we have a unique opportunity to be a good Samaritan as people are putting the pieces of their lives back together again. But what a shepherd is a non-judgmental listener, an intercessor who prays with and for the family. It's a coach helping them think through the problems, establish a plan of recovery for themselves, a connector of resources with their needs. They're a spiritual caseworker empowering the family to be once again self-sustaining. They're a champion who advocates on behalf of the family to others that around them that want to help. And what we've found over and over again, there's a lot of people willing and ready to help, but if there's a shepherd who would be bold enough to go through the training and say, I'll take point, I'll connect the family, I'll find out their needs. If they're beginning to share with others, man, we just over and over again, we've seen God move upon the hearts of people to come to the table to bring resources to it. So what a shepherd is not, and this is a helpful piece of information, they're not expected to have the family live in their home. They're not expected to meet all the family's financial needs out of their own personal means. They're not expected to help the family beyond what's been affected by the disaster. So again, if they didn't lose a car as a result of the disaster, we're not expected to restore or replace a car, right? Now, a group may choose to do that based on the set of circumstances, a single mom that's in need of it. But again, that's not the expectation. And ultimately, the shepherd would not be responsible for doing what the family can and should be doing for themselves. More info can be found at adrn.org/shepherd related to this. In fact, we actually have this document on that website available for you to share with others, whether you're to pull it off and share it some way digitally, print it out, or point people to that website, adrn.org/shepherd. Also on this document, on the very bottom, is listed some upcoming disaster relief shepherd training. And really, that's the next step for anybody that's interested in it, is to go through the 3-hour training and find out what it means to shepherd, what it means to address emotional, spiritual, and physical needs. How do I effectively do that? How do I come alongside of a family? What are healthy boundaries for me to have? What are resources available to me right now that I can connect with this family and make sure that they're aware of and begin to get help immediately? So I hope that's a resource to you. A couple of other things just to make note of in the response and recovery element of this is that there's really multiple phases when one works with a family. The first phase is the assessment phase. Really, it's that info gathering for a shepherd and their small group, right? Hey, what's their situation? What do they have need of? What's our capability to help meet that need? 2 is the development of the recovery plan. 3 is the implementation of that recovery plan. And then ultimately, the 4th is closure. And so it's healthy at any point, even if the relationship continues, right? Maybe they join your church, join the small group, right? They want to be a part of this family. That's our ultimate hope, isn't it? But at some point, it's healthy to transition from the kind of the helper to the one who is being helped to more of equals in that relationship. And I've had the privilege of sponsoring a couple of families through multiple disasters, and the very first family that we had helped, ultimately it came to that place where I was asking them, like, hey, is there anything else that you have need of and that we're able to help with? She's like, no, you've helped in this, you've helped in that, I think we're good. And then I was able to say in response, okay, it seems like our work here is done, but I want to remain in connection with you if we can, right? And so it's healthy for the nature of that relationship to change. I will tell you, just as an encouragement, that very first family that I had the privilege of sponsoring, I'm on the phone with her, the very first time saying, hey, I'm with such and such a church. We're working with Austin Disaster Relief Network, and we just want to find out if there's any needs that you have right now that we might be able to help you meet. So she began to identify some of those. I prayed with her at the end of that call, and then I called her a second time just to ask some follow-up details, some clarifying questions, and then had the opportunity to pray with her again. Now, before I had one opportunity to provide any kind of physical help, this woman at the end of the second call in prayer is in tears, asking me the question, why do you guys care for me so much? And you don't even know me. I didn't leave her guessing. I told her it was because the love that Jesus has shared with me, I am compelled to share it with others. right? And isn't that our hope, that every one of these survivors would look at this kind of response from the local church and that it would beg the question from deep within, like, who are you people? And what in the world would compel you to do such a thing? But surely God is in our midst, right? And it's because of the redemptive work He's done in our lives. He's compelled us to share that work with others. There is funding available at the table. This may be helpful for you to know. I mean, if you're a church that you have expended all your benevolence fund because you've been helping some of your members just navigate through this COVID world, there is funding available at the table. In fact, a church could come alongside of a family, a small group come alongside of a family without one dime in their pocket because of all the money that's been raised through this response effort. And just to give you some kind of perspective, though we don't kind of blast maybe this broadly across the city, we have the capability to fund potentially up to $15,000 per family based on the needs. Now, obviously, somebody who's a renter wouldn't qualify for that higher threshold, but somebody who owned their home, had water damage, and doesn't have insurance, or had insurance but doesn't have deductible money to pay for it, these kinds of funds can be available up to that amount. So think about that. All the funds that we're raising through this effort, our ultimate goal is to funnel them through you, through the local church, as you're coming alongside of these families with relational connection. And what's so powerful about this shepherding process is every other kind of response effort that we do is transactional in nature. If you're showing up and you're in a shelter, I'm not going to have a relationship with you for very long. The same is true if I'm giving you a ride in my car, if I'm dropping off water, or even mucking out your house. Maybe have a chance to pray with you, maybe share the gospel, but then I'm moved on. And so is this survivor. But the uniqueness about shepherding families is there's repeated opportunities to both demonstrate God's love for them and to declare the hope that we have in Him. And that's where the transformation happens in these lives of people that we serve over and over again. It's at this place. And this is why it's our desire to connect these families. Our number one goal is to connect these families with the local church to help them back on their feet. So we have a team here at ADRN that's intended to support those within your congregations, those disaster relief shepherd leads that are maybe the upline within your church, to make sure that they've got their tough questions answered and can navigate well through this process. There are some stats that I'm not going to include here, but I'm going to include in the email that goes along with this video or in other forms. Maybe I will tell you just on a highest level, but just know that this could be updated over time. To date, there are 229 families that have gone through our intake process, and 182 of them are asking to be connected to the local church. 40 of them have been identified as high priority, and there's a number that are Spanish speaking. The majority of these families are actually renters, and that usually makes them as part of this shepherding process on that shorter cycle, more toward the 1 to 3 month window versus the 3 to 6 month window, because they don't have to navigate through all the unique dynamics homeowners might as they're trying to restore their home. But again, what an opportunity that we have to come alongside of these families. I'm going to share with you one last document that my hope is will be helpful for you as you think about next steps. Because up to this point, we've kind of explained what it is, kind of how this process works. But if I'm a pastor or a spiritual leader of a people, I'd be thinking, well, what do I do next? How do I take this information and translate it and share it with people and give them opportunities to engage and respond? And that's what this document's intended to do. It's entitled Church Leadership: Next Steps to Shepherd Families. And so step one is to prayerfully determine, as a pastor, a spiritual leader, how you will respond. There's a couple of approaches. One is what we call a top-down approach. That's where a church would say, hey, we want to take a family, or we're ready to take 3 families or 5 families, and that's done from a church leadership level. At that point, we kind of can maybe schedule a meeting to fill you in with more details related to that, but you would let us know that in short, and we would give you the information on those families. There's benefit in doing that for a couple of reasons. One, now you have details of multiple families versus the kind of the general sense of sharing with a congregation saying, hey, there's families in need. You may feel somewhat disconnected from, but you're trying to cast vision behind that and allowing their hearts to connect so that they can respond with compassion, godly compassion. But when you're able to share the details of families, like, hey guys, our church is taking on 5 families, and I'm asking who of you would be willing to step forward and help shepherd them. Here's the details. We've got a single mom who's 33 years old, or this one. In fact, I'll share with you a real example. One of these survivors that came through the intake center, when my wife was actually working it, she said the first family that came to her was a single mom in her young 30s. And this woman not only had 1 child of her own, she had just recently inherited 5 children from her sister. Now, I don't know all the dynamics of that, but you've got a young 30-year-old mother who has 6 kids, single mom. This woman broke down at that table. She lost it. She began to tear up, overwhelmed by the weight of that responsibility. What would it look like for a church to come alongside of her in that process for these next couple of months as she navigates through what recovery from the winter storm could look like? She gets her feet back underneath her again. So that's a top-down approach. And so there's another benefit of that approach, which is what we call group shepherding. So this would allow maybe one person at a church to take on or be point for multiple families. And I'll give you a couple of, and then the other, actually before I give examples, I'll talk about the other approach. The other is a bottom-up approach, and that's hey, we're going to encourage everybody in the congregation, hey, this is important, we're a part of this network of churches, there is real need still in this community, and you have an opportunity to make an internal impact. Would you respond to that in this time, in this season of need? And so you're sharing that, you're telling them, hey, this is your next step. You can go get ADRN training. They'll explain to you the process of how to do that. Do it with your small group, right? So that's a bottom-up approach. Some examples of how it's worked in both instances. We had a small church on the network some years ago. There were a church of about 70 people or so in total, and they took on 5 families from a top-down approach. And it was actually one person that was a highly engaged volunteer, but also connected with church leadership. She said, man, I want to do this. So she took point for 5 families, was the relational connect to find out the needs, to kind of work that spiritual case worker element of it. But then she was able to go back to her whole congregation and share the needs. And so groups would be able to form and help show up maybe on a Saturday to help meet some of these needs for varying families depending on how it looked. We've had examples of where in a small congregation, somebody would put sticky notes on a little poster board that took on a family and just said, hey, I'm just going to break down the needs. So, we're met with this family, they've got 10 needs, put them on sticky notes, take a sticky note, right? Take a need, each one. Another approach, we've had a large church on the network that did more of a bottom-up approach, but because of the kind of questions about what does this look like and the uncertainty, they basically decided, hey, we're going to start with one family. We're just going to start with one. We probably have capacity to do more. Let's just start with one, feel it out. But as that began to take place and those questions got answered and we realized like, hey, this wasn't all that difficult, right? God was with us. He was helping us. There's resources at the table. All of a sudden it gave vision now for others to do it. And so what started with one at this larger church ended up being in that response somewhere near 30 families being sponsored through that local church, through small groups. And the very first shepherd that came alongside of this family ended up becoming the disaster relief shepherd lead. Now it's like, okay, you've done it, you've closed the case, you've got experience, now help other people do it. And so God has worked powerfully that way as well. So step 2 in this church leadership next steps documents to identify someone on your staff or leadership team who will help oversee this process. It may be someone, again, on staff initially, pastoral care or an elder, maybe a disaster relief coordinator, a volunteer. It may be ultimately that disaster relief shepherd lead, but someone who can be the upline within your church, a direct support for those small groups who are shepherding families. Step 3 would be encourage his people to respond to the need. There's a couple of different approaches. One is a broad approach, right? You cast the net broad, saying maybe it's through a Sunday morning platform or message, hey guys, we're going to respond to the call. This is the need. Or maybe you're reaching out to all small groups within your church. A more targeted approach might also be effective. Maybe you've identified these are all the people that have been actively responding in this disaster so far. So they've smelt it, they've tasted it. These are, people that showed up at the shelter and served or went out and helped muck out a house. I'm going to reach out to those people because I know their hearts are in it already and say, hey, personally ask them, hey, would you be willing to come along alongside of a family. And that's a powerful ask when it's personal, when it's relational, right? A targeted approach might also be to reach out to specific small groups within your church. Maybe it's the men's group, or the women's group, for examples. Step 4 would be to point those interested towards our interest form and shepherd training. Again, adrn.org/shepherd has both of these things. The reason we have an interest form, it's a good engagement point for people who have maybe not yet taken the training, right? If it's a 3-hour training, we don't want somebody to get halfway through it and just kind of have too many questions and get discouraged. They can let us know right off the bat, hey, I'm interested in doing this. And so that way, our team has the ability to follow up with them if we notice maybe they didn't go through the training or complete some of the other requirements to do it. There are a couple of other elements, we require for shepherds to come alongside of a family, that they be connected to a network church, a church that's joined our network. The value of that is for covering, protection, and support through this network that represents, right? That ADRN ultimately represents. And so that's important to us. If you're a church that's not yet on the network, just connected in crisis maybe, that's okay. It's a pretty simple process to get you on board. But that would be important before a church can officially shepherd families. One of the other elements would be a background check for these shepherds and even our basic training. But I'll tell you, if a small group of 10 people, it's only required that one would come alongside of a family. Let me state that again. It's only required that one would go through the training to have direct connection, relational connection with the family. It's been trained, equipped through the training. They can now come back as the one person that's been trained and share all what they've learned in the training and also the dynamics about the family once they've connected with that family, and empower the others to come to the table and help meet the need. So a group of 10 can shepherd, but it's only one that's required to go through that shepherd training, the person who takes point on it. Again, at our website, adrn.org/shepherd, that they can find out what upcoming trainings are. If you're interested as a church to facilitate a training, that's an opportunity as well. So our training right now is in video form. It's facilitated online. Our encouragement would be, maybe there's enough interest in your church. Maybe it's the outreach pastor, maybe it's the disaster relief coordinator, or just an engaged volunteer that's ready to do whatever's next and whatever's needed. You might get the word out of your church, because now this gives you the ability to do it on your schedule, your timeline, at your congregation, and in a physical form, because we're doing these every Thursday in an online format that's facilitated, right? But there's real strength in people from the same congregation coming to that meeting. Maybe 10 show up to it, and they decide, hey, between us, we can take 2 families if there's not already small groups that they're a part of. So it could look like a number of things, but if your church is interested in sending a leader to get trained in how to facilitate that training, it takes maybe 1.5 hours, maybe 2 to train on that, and we would love to put that in your hands, to empower you with that information. Your leaders within your church could do it multiple times, to have the format to facilitate it, to push play on the video, to discussion time to facilitate a bit of discussion, and just to communicate next steps. It's really that simple. And ultimately, point number 5 is sharing stories. How do you kind of engage in next steps? Is share stories. Stories are compelling. Stories are what allow people's heart to connect with the compassion of God for people and want to respond, right? And there's a difference between pity. Pity is a remorseful feeling, but compassion requires action, doesn't it? And Jesus saw the need, and he felt the pain in some form or fashion, and he had compassion. He responded in a physical way. And that would be our encouragement to all those willing to come alongside and respond in this way, to respond to the needs of these families. Sharing stories could look like a couple of things. If you took a top-down approach and said, hey, we want 3 families, then you could share the specific needs of those families and say, hey, guys, here's details. Man, allow people's hearts to connect. Like, wow, single mom. I was a single mom, in my younger years. I want to help this one. There's something I've got to do to walk alongside of this family, right? Or it could be that you've taken the bottom-up approach, and the first people that begin to sponsor families within your church, you're allowing them to tell their story. Like, hey, John, come up here and tell us what it's been like for you and your small group to come alongside of this family. And again, it inspires, it helps people see that, hey, this is possible. I've had a volunteer tell me, like, hey, I'm a grandma. I never saw myself doing anything like this. I bake cookies, you know. But here she was shepherding a family, and it wasn't just any family. This was a Latino pastor of a very small congregation over in East Austin that was affected by some of the floods a few years ago. Like, wow, what an opportunity. And she didn't have all the answers, right? But God did, and she was encountering God in the midst of that response. And again, with a support team, a church around her to help her through it. And of course, our team is a support as well with resources on the table. So my hope for you is that you would deeply consider, hey, can our church respond in this way? Or how can our church respond, whether it be a top-down or bottom-up approach? And that you begin to take the next step. We just know that over and over again, God has a plan and a purpose for these families, redemption and restoration. And God's plan A for redemption in the earth by the power of His Spirit is through His church. It's through you. It's through us. And here we are with opportunity facing us. Well over 100 families asking to be connected to a local church. What's possible if every one of them got connected with a local church to walk with them, to help them back on their feet? Maybe even not all the answers, but pointing to the one who does have all the answers, right? What kind of redemption and restoration could break out at these apartment complexes that they may come from, or communities that they may inhabit? What kind of generations could be affected as mothers and fathers give their lives to the Lord and surrender to His leadership in these humbling times, right? Affecting the children and the children's children. This is our hope. This is our desire. This is what we're after. Ultimately, the transformation of lives, communities, and cities. Will you join us in this response to see every one of these families shepherded? May God be with you.